Gaetan, speak to me about anxiety. What exactly is it, and what do people get wrong about it?
Yeah, anxiety is a feeling of, it's related to nervousness, to worries, to this type of feelings and emotions. And in the literature, within psychology, they often disentangle it from fear, which is a bit more of a direct feeling or emotion where people are much more afraid, directly really want to escape, for instance, really feel physiological changes, which is a bit more intense and more prominent. So anxiety is like a very a more faint version, let's say, of fear.
Okay, and what are people typically anxious of? So you've looked at anxiety in different contexts. What are the typical causes?
Yeah, so typically I think people are often afraid of, or at least what you see with regard to anxiety disorders. Some frequent ones are things like spider phobia, fear of snakes, fear of heights, fear of closed spaces. So those are some typical things. Social evaluation is also something that people are often worried about or afraid about. Needles. So those are some examples.
Oh, there's a common statistic or a fact that people are more anxious of, yeah, people are more anxious of public speaking than they are of death itself. And fear is like the one thing you think if somebody's scared, they are scared they're gonna die. Is there any truth to that fact that seems to be somewhat popular in mainstream media?
Sorry, what do you mean with what popular fact are you thinking about?
Oh, that people are more scared of public speaking than they are of death itself.
Yeah, it might be. I don't know about exact statistics, but I think an important difference is that that is a very far away a threat, very abstract. Whereas fear of public speaking, that might be more direct, especially if you have to give a presentation or you need to do something related to social evaluation. So yeah, I think that's a crucial difference, and yeah, to some extent also that is unavoidable. Whereas public speaking you could avoid if you don't like it.
Okay, so it's a combination of public speaking, it's here now, and you can actually see it taking place in front of you. You can see the consequences of whatever you say, that's it's playing out in front of you in real time, whereas death is, somewhat unknown. Like, sure, it's going to come, but it's this uncertain phenomena they in the wilderness. Like, it can come whenever it comes, and well, it's beyond our control. Okay.
Because even though I think some people are very nervous or very anxious about getting a disease, for instance, some people worry all the time that they might have cancer or another very serious disease. So it's called health phobia or has some other name. So some people really do worry a lot that they might have a very serious disease. So people differ quite a bit in what they're afraid of. Some people are more worried about their health, other more about social context. Yeah.
So, what is the exact distinction between fear and anxiety? So, you said fear seems to be more extreme, and anxiety, um, somewhat more on the lower extreme. Is it just a matter of magnitude, or is it two completely different things?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it seems to be a matter of magnitude. I think they're on the same spectrum, let's say, of anxiety being a quite faint version of fear. Some other scientists, I believe it's really something different, something qualitatively different, but I'm not sure. I'm not really convinced about really the arguments or the ideas for that. So I think it's like a fainter version because the threat that is there is less concrete and less specifically pronounced, I think.
Okay, so as somebody who researches it, how exactly do you research fear and anxiety? Like, how do you know exactly how scared somebody is of something, and whether it is that particular thing that they are scared of? Like, what are the telltale signs?
Yeah, normally as a researcher, you can look at least three things to measure fear, let's say. For instance, you can just ask people how afraid they are. So, really, the subjective component. People can self report on what they're feeling. Another way is to measure physiological changes. For instance, when people are afraid, their heart rate goes a little bit up, or they get clammy hands, so their skin conductance level changes. So those are some physiological ways to operationalize fear and anxiety. And also you can look at their behavior. If people are very nervous or they pull away or they try to avoid the situation, they try to go away from the situation. Again, that's a way to operationalize whether somebody is afraid.
Okay, and what can influence somebody being afraid of things?
Um, well, what we, at least what I looked at a lot in the lab, is whether people can learn to be afraid, can be conditioned to be afraid. So in the lab, we showed people, for instance, like colored lamps or something like that, and then we told them this could be followed by an electric shock, for instance. Um, and there we studied how people can learn to become afraid of something essentially neutral. So that's one way of studying fear and studying why some people are afraid of certain things. Some other approaches are to look at people's personality. Some people are personality-wise, they call it neuroticism. They score higher on this personality trait than others. So that's also a way to study, yeah, individual differences in anxiety sensitivity.
Okay, so the same thing that you can do with a dog, with the classic Pavlov's dogs, where you condition a dog to, have a certain response, where you ring the bell each time you feed it, and eventually, the moment you can ring the bell, they're going to start salivating, expecting food. And the same thing you can do with fear. You can predispose people to being fearful of something. Even if there's no reason for somebody to be scared, if you just keep associating something that people would be scared of with something else, they naturally become. Um, is this used anywhere? Like, I would imagine it can be quite a lethal political tool to instill fear into a broad population.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think fear is something that's quite regularly used. I think in political discussions or discourse, it's often about things maybe escalating or getting worse, or for instance, economy or inflation might get worse, or an immigration problem could get worse, or climate change could get worse. Um, so I think fear is quite regularly used by not politicians or particular groups or organizations to try and convince people to do something or to motivate them. Yeah, and sometimes it's justified, sometimes it's not. So that's really up to several people to evaluate whether or not this fear is justified. But I think it's fear is quite often used in political communication for sure.
And what makes this fear conditioning more effective? Because I imagine, just like with Pavlov's dogs, the first time you do it, it's not very effective, and it actually seems quite insignificant. But the more you do it, the more it becomes associated with that stimulus. Now, with people, would it be the same thing if that it's consistency that drives it?
Mm. Yeah, that seems to be part of it indeed. People, when you repeat something or you train it more often, it becomes more believable, and people and it seems to work better. So that's the case in the lab. That's the also sometimes called the reinforcement rate or the number of reinforcements within the lab that helps to make the conditioning more effective. So that's one way. Repetition is one way to strengthen the effect. Yeah.
And what other ways can strengthen the effect?
Well, I think maybe the intensity of the threat or of the stimulus that you use. So in the lab, we often use like a mild electric shock, something that people find unpleasant but not too unpleasant because we want to, yeah, keep it doable and approachable for students. And we are limited, of course, by ethical considerations. So we use a very mild electric shock. But I can imagine if you use a more intense electric shock, or another type of stimulus, that the conditioning may become more effective because what you experience is more surprising, it's more intense, and that will probably generate stronger results or stronger effects. Yeah.
Okay, so having it more often and more intense will generate stronger effects. And, well, what about, again, going to the example of using it as a political tool? You know, you might not be able to subject people to a pain, but you can make it more repetitive. Like you could have a political candidate repeating the same message over and over and over. But in terms of intensity, what do they look like in that context? How can they make this fear conditioning more effective by creating a more intense feeling? What do they do there?
Well, I'm not a political scientist, so I haven't really studied this communication by politicians or anything. So that's not really my field of research. But yeah, I think again, like to some extent, people can yeah, make the potential threat seem bigger or smaller depending on communication, right? You could say, oh, if there's more immigration, there might be a lot of crime and other things and violent attacks and whatever within the US or within Europe or whatever. Or you could, if you use the example of climate change, you could say, oh, there are sea levels may rise and a lot of people will lose their homes and there will be high intensity local weather events like storms and stuff. So you can make it more vivid. You can make it maybe also more visual. You can use examples. You can yeah, look for, yeah, try to emphasize the message more by using this type of communication, I think.
Okay, so it sounds a lot like looking at what matters to people, you know, where the shock is the physical pain, you know. Physical pain is associated with this is harmful for you, it can possibly result in death, where that would be more looking at, okay, what are the existential threats that a person might have and how that plays out. And something I've been reading up recently on is in terms of like the narrative approach to psychology. So the idea with the narrative approach is one of the ideas is when you hear a story, you're not merely hearing the words and hearing the story. You know, when you hear a word, you picture like everything associated with that word, every single experience you've had. So if I say the word dog, you probably see the image of a dog. That would be one thing. But then it's also you have all the parts of your brain light up that are associated with every single memory. So it will be the memory of a dog that maybe bit you, or it will be the memory of the dog that you grew up with. All of that stuff coming to the forefront. And I guess looking at it in terms of conditioning, it's, you know, as you have more of those experiences, the story running within your mind becomes more reinforced to have a certain, you know, narrative structure and the way it would play out. And certain things come to mean more to you. Like a lot of people would, you know, if it's your own child and you see something happen to them, it hurts you a lot more. If you see your child's in danger, you're going to be a lot more fearful than if it's some stranger or some person that you've never encountered. And, you know, bring it to anxiety. I also see a lot of anxiety not being experiences that people themselves have had, where it can also be an experience you've seen somebody else have, which, again, from a narrative approach, it's when somebody tells you a story, you experience the story yourself, like subconsciously. How significant is that in terms of people's experiences? Because I saw you researched quite a bit about COVID and how it affected people. How much of the fear people experience was due to their own experiences as opposed to what they were seeing all around them, hearing around them, and that um, the media was telling them everywhere?
Yeah, that's a nice question. I think for people often, yeah, we're very social animals and we use language for a lot of things. So I think a lot of our worries and things we're yeah keeping us busy are based on verbal information and observing things in other people. I think also related to COVID, I think a lot of the things we were worried about were predictions about the future, right? So you can be afraid of things that have happened to you before, but mostly because you think they might happen again in the future. So in essence, a lot of things that we are afraid of, or all the things that we are afraid of, are actually hypothetical things that might happen in the future. And that can be based on things that happen to you yourself, but it can also be based on verbal information of other people or observing other people, what is happening to them. Um, and there also with COVID, I think concerns about the economy getting worse, or concerns about you yourself becoming sick or getting long COVID, or the pandemic being misused for particular purposes or whatever. A lot of these things are based on other information. They're not based on what has happened. Of course, there were some problems with the economy, there were some shortages, but it was not a complete meltdown. So it was more about things that could potentially happen, not things that had actually happened before. So yeah, I think a lot of our worries are based on hypothetical information that we got from other people. It can also be based on our own experience. For instance, if you got bitten by a dog, you yourself got bitten by a dog, and then you might become afraid of dogs in the future. That's based on your own experience. But could also, for instance, develop because you saw somebody else being attacked by a dog. So yeah, humans are very can adapt themselves quite efficiently to the environment and to new information, also through other channels than through your own experience.
It sounds a lot like a game of risk mitigation. Where you think this experience happened, so it is more likely that this experience will happen again, if I'm understanding you correctly.
Yeah, I mean it's for people, yeah, and for other also other animals. It's important to keep safe and being healthy and not getting injuries and not also getting financial problems and stuff like that are very important for your future health and fitness. Let's say evolutionary fitness. So. Yeah, it is a sort of optimization strategy for people to use, being afraid of certain things. It's a very adaptive emotion in most cases. Not always. Sometimes people are too afraid, but generally it's an adaptive emotion.
Okay, and what are the mental and health implications of fear and anxiety? What impact does it have on a person? So apart from like your heart rate raising and all of that things, what else can it do to a person that might be good or bad?
Yeah, I think anxiety disorders are they're the I think the most frequent, like together with depression, they're the most frequent class of mental disorders. So they're very prevalent. And the yeah big problem with anxiety disorders, if people are very afraid, it can interfere with their lives. For instance, if you're very socially anxious, you might not perform as well in life or with relationships than you would want to perform, and it can keep you yeah sort of stuck. It can prevent you from developing in your career or in your relationships. If somebody is very phobic of, for instance, getting a disease, they may overuse healthcare systems and they may constantly feel on edge and very anxious. And that's yeah, that's just a very frustrating feeling, and it can also it's often related or is comorbid with other types of problems such as depression or just worries or health complications. So anxiety disorders are really prevalent, and they can come together with other types of problems in like the social environment, in with your health, and in yeah, relationships and work and professional development.
Okay, yeah, I can imagine how that would be like a horrible place for somebody to live in, where everything around you is basically a threat to you. You know, you never trust anybody, you don't trust anything around you, you're constantly fearful of your health, so you avoid everything. It limits the experiences that you can experience and that you'd be willing to experience. You know, if you are socially anxious, you're not going to want to go and interact with other people because every single interaction for you is an opportunity for you to humiliate yourself or to fail at, trying to win the approval of somebody else. And health-wise, if you are a hypochondriac, you're not going to go out because, well, you might get sick. You might just breathe in the wrong fumes or something, and that means death for you. Being in that state, I imagine, is also quite stressful, and you'd have a lot of health complications coming out of that as well, where the moment something happens, it's like your fight or flight response gets activated, and your reaction might be to get out of that situation as soon as possible, ASAP. If you're worried about catching germs from somebody, you're not going to shake their hands, so it makes it difficult to connect with people, not having that physical connection. So you also looked at the long-term effects of fear, which I found interesting because there's a lot of studies done on like fear in terms of a response, but not much done on what happens thereafter. What situation, what state are people in after 14 months, I think it was, that you looked at, 14 months after COVID, what were the impacts? What can you tell me about the long-term effects of anxiety?
Yeah, in that study, we actually examined the progression of fear of COVID throughout the pandemic. So, across a time span indeed of 14 months. And we saw that people were mostly anxious in the beginning of the pandemic, and that gradually declined a bit. Didn't really go away completely, but it did decline. Um, Mostly to examine how this developed throughout the pandemic. We didn't really look at long-term effects, mostly like at what influences this fear. So we saw that in general, women were a bit more afraid than men. That's something we often see with anxiety disorders, that women are a bit more sensitive to being afraid than men. Um, and we saw some other things, that people that use certain media channels more regularly, they were more anxious than people that did not do that. So those were some observations from that study. I Yeah, I don't know about long-term effects. I think with the pandemic, I think most of it went away. I think maybe some people are still really worried about getting sick, or maybe getting COVID, or getting long COVID. I would say that comes really close to, at this point, with the pandemic being largely contained and so on. I think it comes close to indeed hypochondria, because I think the fear is somewhat out of proportion to the actual threat. Maybe not if you have a chronic disease, or some other vulnerabilities, but some people I think are a bit too afraid, and thereby yeah, could meet the criteria for anxiety disorder. But we haven't really looked at those people. That's something I would like to do, but we studied more on a population level, on a big sample, and we studied the progression. So we didn't really look at people that really had like pathological levels of fear, unfortunately. But that would be also interesting to do, and also just look at how these people can be helped or treated. That would be interesting.
Okay. Yeah, I can understand why people that are more exposed to the media would be more fearful, because it's, more exposure. You have repeated exposure to the stimulus, so it becomes reinforced further and further and further. But why is there the distinction between man and woman? Why are women typically more afraid than men?
Yeah, there's some discussion about this. So some one idea is that maybe men don't really want to report that they're afraid of certain things because of gender roles or expectations, and thereby they don't really report that they're afraid. That's something that might contribute. You also have something that I find a bit more compelling is evolutionary explanation that men in general tend to take more risks, and that has, in an evolutionary sense, good reasons because it's useful in an evolutionary sense for men to take more risk and maybe have more children and more offspring, whereas women are in general a bit more careful. They invest more physiologically seen in pregnancies and children, and thereby should be a bit more careful on average than men. Whereas men, if they take a lot of risk and they live a short life, but they can have 20, 30, 40 kids, let's say, then maybe they die very young, but at least they've passed on their genetic material. And that may, in an evolutionary sense, make men on average a bit more risk willing, risk taking than women that are maybe a bit more careful, a bit more conservative in taking risks.
Okay, yeah, I find it interesting that you're mentioning evolution's role. So, something that I've been researching in prep for this episode, after you told me, you've been looking more at evolutionary psychology and placebo, is the role of evolutionary psychology. And the underlying principle is basically a lot of the adaptations and stuff that we have gone through is done in service of survival and reproduction. Those are the two fundamentals for all life forms, basically. And, there's a lot said about different factors, like why did we evolve to have disposable thumbs? It's so we're able to grasp things, we're able to use weapons, and that sort of things. What role does fear and anxiety have in an evolutionary context?
Yeah, so fear and anxiety have a very big role in evolutionary context because, as you say, the whole point of in evolution is to uh, survive and pass on your genes. More passing on your genes than surviving, but still surviving is essential if you want to pass on your genes. So it's really crucial for humans, but like nearly all animals, to survive and to protect themselves from harm. And fear is an emotion that has been evolved throughout our evolutionary history to help us with that. So when we're afraid, we tend to go away from situations that can be potentially harmful. So we have this very specific response, the fight or flight response, to help us with that. When there is a threat, for instance, there is a bear or an angry dog, we tend to go out of the way, try to run away. If running away is not an option, we try to fight the threat. And that's something that humans do to protect themselves, and also other animals. I think dogs, cows, apes, rabbits, and so on. They all become afraid when there's a direct threat. So it's a very adaptive emotion to be afraid and to be anxious. It helps you to survive, and that's very important. Yeah.
It sounds like it's, the body's alarm system. That it tells you, danger, 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 get out of here, or do something. You have to get ready to fight or something. It does that. Um, but if I look at a lot of anxiety, it kind of seems somewhat maladaptive. Like, what is the benefit of feeling socially anxious, or the benefit of feeling anxious about, if I go outside, I'm gonna get wet? Like, you have some um, disorders like that, for instance. What benefit does that have in an evolutionary context?
Yeah, that's that's very fascinating. Sometimes some anxiety disorders are a bit difficult to understand, a bit funny or so. I recently saw something that people are afraid of bananas, which is a very weird phobia. Um, so some of these things I cannot directly explain from an evolutionary perspective, but there's one general principle that helps to understand it a bit more, and that's the false alarm, false positive framework. So in general, it's better, like if you want to survive, with fear, it's better to have to believe false alarms, like, oh, maybe this person is not friendly, or is friendly, but I will assume that he or she is not friendly because um, if she's actually not friendly, it might be very problematic. So it's better to be conservative and to take, like, to run away from a threat that's not an actual threat. Like, this dog is not actually aggressive, but I rather not take my chances than taking your chances and then being bitten or being attacked. So in general, with fear, it's good to be a bit more careful, and that's a strategy that a lot of us do, and that's also in different domains. Also in social domains, our social environment for people is very important. People are essentially group animals, right? If I would drop you or myself in the jungle, we would probably not survive. But if you drop like 20, 30, 40, 50 people together, they can work together, they can figure it out, they can help each other, and so on. So as humans, we really have to stick together, we have to work in a group. And that, because we need to do that, we also need to be very sensitive about social evaluations. If people think, oh, you're doing something silly or stupid, or then we have to be very mindful of that and to do something about that. Because if we get into trouble with our social environment, that can be very costly for humans. Now that's a little bit less important than, let's say, 200 or 2000 years ago or 10,000 years ago. So that's why we're very sensitive to social evaluation.
Okay, is that why I would be scared to go and approach that cute girl that I might see sitting at on the bench?
Yeah, maybe too. Yeah, and maybe you're still too worried about social rejection and people thinking yeah, you're not a good guy or a nice guy or not an attractive guy. So I think people are very worried about that, and really keep it in their mind, and worry about that a lot. Yeah.
Why though? Like, why do we care so much about social rejection? What value is in, yeah, what value is there in having this fear?
Yeah, I think again because of our the importance of being part of a group, of a social group for humans. We really have to. We're really social animals, and we have to live in a group to survive and to find a good partner. Uh, and let's say if a girl rejects you, maybe her family might not like that you approached her, or maybe her friends will think, oh, she rejected you, so you must not be such a nice guy or not such an attractive guy. So it has also social repercussions within a group. So there are many, yeah, just this one social rejection can have a lot of implications. But one thing also is that one important thing to consider is that maybe 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, this was more important than now. If now you get rejected by a social group, you can quite easily find another group, or you can hang out with your other friends, or there's a whole society that helps you to survive and find nice people. But our brains have been developed in a different environment where it was much more important to be very sensitive to these social cues, and we lived in much smaller groups. So in this smaller group, if you did something that people would disapprove of, that would have much bigger consequences than right now. But yeah, that's just how evolution works. Evolution is quite slow, whereas our countries and our society in which we live in has been developed at a incredible pace over the last couple of 100 years. How we live now is very different than we lived 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and so on.
Yeah, we're living with old programming, program. Yeah, programming that is made for a world from a time before, where if you take evolution, it typically happens over millions of years, maybe a couple hundred thousands at the least, where we've had so many changes happen rapidly. Where even if you just think of communication, like we're doing this podcast online, would this have been possible um, 20 years ago? No, not likely. And, the world is changing so much, and we still have this programming for before where we are fearful of, like, snakes, for instance, as you mentioned. There are so many people that can grow up with having never encountered a snake in their life. They might not even know what a snake is. But the moment they see it, they have a fearful and frightful response. I mean, it can go to the extreme where people are so scared of hairbands because they perceive it to be snakes. And, there's so much that is going to change of the world as well. And as the world changes, that introduces new anxieties and new fears. I also see, the fear of people losing their jobs to artificial intelligence, the fear of existential extinction due to AI as well, due to artificial intelligence becoming smarter than us and, coming to the conclusion that they are superior to us. They don't have to answer to us. We should be answering to them. And if I look in terms of that, it becomes very easy for people to become maladapted to the world in which we live. Because before, if you were living in a village and you got rejected by a girl, that would be a small village. You could be in a village of 50 people at most. If you got rejected or something happened, the whole village is going to know about it. And I imagine it's still that fear in your mind that everybody's going to know about it, everybody's going to talk about it. But in reality now, it's like, the social context in which we exist is so broad. If you go on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, whatever it is, there are literally billions of people on it. If one person, you DM them or whatever and they reject you, absolutely nobody is going to know about it. Yeah, and bring it back to when we look at we have not adapted to the world in which we exist. What changes do you see being the most significant in the anxiety that people feel?
Yeah, I mean, it's also an interesting direction this conversation is going because I think there are actually two things. We're afraid of like historic threats like snakes and spiders and social evaluations that are generally quite concrete. At the same time, like you said, the world is changing so rapidly. So I think people also now have some, yeah, maybe some worries about the world developing so quickly that they cannot keep up. Like, for instance, with AI or social media or, um, yeah, space travel, for instance, people going to Mars and so on. So there are also some threats, let's say, like very vague threats that people have not a very good grasp on, that are very unknown and uncertain to people, like also people stealing your passwords and stuff like that, that are very new, very novel, and people don't really have defense responses for this type of threats. And that I think also makes people quite worried and find it quite difficult to deal with these rapid changes. Like, for instance, our parents. There are a lot of jokes about boomers going around that are not really adapt to technology and stuff like that. But you just have to imagine that they grew up with things like 20 years ago. A lot of the things we have now were not even heard of. So yeah, that's funny that like now in this point in history we have these historical threats we're still worried about, like social evaluations and snakes and spiders and heights and so on, and we have these things going into the future, like these rapid technological developments that may also pose a threat, but that are unknown, and we don't have sort of strategies to deal with it.
Yeah, and the thing with fear, it's always predictive. It's always speculative. Like you are trying to make the best guess you can that this is what could go wrong or this is what could happen. And there's a book that I read recently. It's Uncharted by Margaret Heffernan, I think it is. And something I found interesting in the book is where she looked at like stock market crashes, yeah. And in any time, there's always going to be people saying, "Oh, there's a market crash imminent." And it's like people always say, "There's a market crash imminent. There's a market crash imminent." There's always like every year there's going to be people saying that, and then at the same time, there's always going to be people saying the opposite, that are going to say, no, there's no crash imminent. It's not going to happen anytime soon. And every year you have that same story repeating. And does that necessarily mean that one or the other is right? No, because it just happens to be by chance. Like the one that says there's no market crash is right until it happens. And as long as it doesn't happen, they seem like they have this clairvoyant ability. They are the psychic that sees it all. And the opposite is also true. Like if the other person keeps predicting there's a market crash coming, the moment there is one, they suddenly seem like, oh, they knew it all along, even though they might have been saying it all over again. And I imagine the same being for an individual. If you constantly have this fear, sure, you might be proven 99.9999999% times wrong. But then if you have that one experience, it sort of gives us justification in it. Oh, I was right all along. How do people make this distinction? Like, what can people do to make this distinction between whether their fear is justified, where there is a very real probability of something happening, or completely delusional, where the chances of something going wrong is so insignificant that trying to avoid it and mitigate it at all costs is just going to cause misery and serve no purpose.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, with fear, you also have something self-reinforcing. Like if you avoid dogs, you will never get bitten, but you will also never get not bitten because you just don't interact with dogs. So being afraid of dogs is a bit self-reinforcing because if you keep avoiding them, the thing you're worried about is not going to happen, and that can continue for a long time. And that's also, yeah, this is like a cycle of negative reinforcement, a cycle of avoidance. Um, so that's a well-known problem. And when we treat people who have an anxiety problem, we try to break this cycle of avoidance. So we motivate them to do exposure exercises, for instance, to talk to people, to go to the park, or to pet a dog, or to hold a spider. We go through exercises with people to help them to break through this cycle of avoidance, so they can learn that the thing they're afraid of doesn't actually happen, or even when it does happen, that it's not as worse, not as horrible as they think it is. Um, and that's a well-known problem with fear and avoidance, is that something avoiding things is self-reinforcing, because if you never talk to the girl you like, she will never say no, but you don't know also if she would say no, or maybe she would say yes. If you keep avoiding, you never know. Um, and that keeps you also stuck. It keeps you from doing things. So people need to learn to break this cycle of avoidance.
Yeah, it sounds like it becomes a self fulfilling prophecy over and over and over again. Because, it's again the dog example. You avoid the dog because you're scared. Because you avoid the dog, you are safe. But it doesn't mean that if you did approach the dog, it would be unsafe. It's you never giving evidence to prove contrary to your belief. So yeah, what can somebody do if they are feeling anxiety? Like, what can they do for themselves to, help them discern whether this is justified or not, or, also to maybe reduce the symptoms that they're feeling? What are steps they can take?
Yeah, so I think if you really have very high levels of anxiety, really get stuck, I think it's good to talk to your doctor, to your GP, and to maybe be referred to a psychologist, because then you can really get like very focused treatment to deal with it. So I don't want to give like almost medical advice at this point, but if you have milder versions of anxiety or fear, it is good to challenge yourself from time to time to maybe go talk to people, maybe to go out, to maybe yeah, challenge yourself in the area you're worried. That's one way. Another way is what seems to help is that when we get anxious, our nervous system it goes into this, let's say, fight or flight mode. It goes into this high arousal mode. And we know from also from research and from clinical practice that breathing, slow paced breathing or attentional breathing, it can help to reduce this hyper arousal. So when you start to breathe lower or breathe more carefully, more attentively, your heart rate will go down. Your physiological system will stop overreacting in the same way. So breathing exercise can also be a good way to stop this, especially this physiological component of anxiety and worrying.
Okay, it sounds like either you can take a top down or bottom up approach, you know. Either you change your mindset and thinking about the thing to change your body's response, or you change your body's functioning. So, like through breathing, you calm down your heart rate and everything to change your mind and the framing behind it. Um, yeah, recently I had a guest that was a coach in NLP, Jay Shafadini. And, you know, something I found interesting when he looked in terms of the approach with NLP is you kind of limit, or not limit, you diminish the the impact of an experience or stimulus. So if you have a memory like a dog that attacked you for some, or yeah, using that same example that we've been using over and over again, you can change the memory. Like memories are also not entirely immutable. You know, that's one of the problems with the court system where they are unable to get a reliable statement from people because the story changes in their minds. And, you know, we can do the same thing with experiences we want to move beyond. You know, where you have the story of the dog, it's a very intense emotion and memory that plays out. So limiting the intensity, like when you remember the memory, um, you know, limiting the colors, making it more grayscale, finding creative ways that, you know, you'd go to somebody and they can help you um, on this journey of healing in a sense. Yeah, and something in terms of fear in the brain. So I'm not too certain on this, and I'm hoping you can tell me more about it. So one thing I saw with the approach with therapy is getting people to, um, yeah, getting people to draw more from their higher brain functioning. So fear is seen as an emotion that we experience in more the primitive part of our brain, you know, in the amygdala, yeah, the back of the head. And then one way is to get people to think more rationally, you know, actually look at the situation more objectively, taking a time to think things through, and then, you know, that takes you out of that natural state of anxiety and, you know, uncertain of what's going on around you. So, how much validity is there to that?
Um, well, I think for me personally, it's interesting to know where emotions are coming from and to take like a brain inspired approach, but there are also some issues because indeed the amygdala activity seems to be related to fear and worries, but it's not the only brain structure that is involved, and it probably serves a lot of different functions. So purely looking at that level, I've not really been convinced or seen a lot of convincing studies that in some way could directly alter this brain activity and really help people. Um, there is some validity to the idea, like what I've been saying it before, that some parts of our emotions and how we think have evolved in a very different environment than we live now. So we're overly afraid of snakes and spiders and social evaluation that we should be. And that's because our brains have not been optimally adjusted to the environment. So, I mean, to some extent we know, but still we tend to be more afraid than we should be about certain things. Um, but I think for now, the best way still to deal with this type of things is really behavior therapy and psychotherapy to try and break the cycle. Sometimes medication can be used also to reduce this feeling of high anxiety and fear. So there are also some medication. But really good examples of where brain activity can be directly altered and really improve fear complaints and things like that. I've not yet seen, because that's not really how the brain works. There is some localization in the brain, but not to such an extent that you can just alter the activity in one area and people feel better. That generally doesn't work like that, because our brain is working as one, yeah, as a complete system. So it's not just one area that does this and the other area that does that. There's often like some overlap and a lot of intercommunication between these brain areas. So that's, I think, yeah, I'm not a neuroscientist, but that's my perspective on it to this, yeah, to so far.
Yeah, that makes sense, especially if you look at how the brain interprets words. Like if I say the word dog, you're not just hearing the word dog, you're hearing the word, you're hearing the sounds, but the parts of your brain that get lit up are all the parts associated with, your memories, your visual component of your brain as well, the smell as well, like you remember the smell of a dog. So to say it's all just in one part is kind of belittling and doing a disservice to the complexity of the brain itself, I would imagine. In terms of research in fear and anxiety, any interesting papers or findings that people can look forward to finding about in the future?
Yeah, I mean, that's again a good question. I think a lot of people are working on it from a lot of different perspectives, like brain science, psychotherapy, evolutionary psychology, many different ways. Also, from a political science perspective, what we were talking about before, which is all very interesting. So I think there's a lot going on. Very interesting work in many different ways. You can use the idea of fear and how people deal with threats and worry about threats, and you can translate that to different areas. Recently, a colleague of mine contacted me. She's working for the Ministry of Taxes, and there they noticed that people are very afraid of taxes, and they're so afraid of opening their tax letters that they fail to pay their taxes in time. Not because they don't want to pay it, but just because they're too worried. So that's like a very specific area where we could maybe apply some insights that we have to maybe help people to become a bit less afraid of just dealing with their taxes. Um, so I think, yeah, it's a very interesting developing area. I think for me personally, I think we should analyze it a bit more from an evolutionary psychology perspective to better understand why people are afraid of these particular things, and also why people struggle with these very quick technological advances, and that we should try and use this information or these insights from evolutionary psychology to create like environments where people don't need to feel anxious all the time. I think now people, because of modern environment, they feel more anxious than they should. Also because it's not been optimized um, for how our brain essentially works. We live in really big groups. We have social media. We're constantly online. We're constantly present. We also always seem to compare each other with yeah, with other people on Instagram and Twitter and so on. I think we can maybe shape our environment with ideas from evolutionary psychology so that people don't have to feel so anxious. I think now people are feeling relatively anxious, maybe a bit more than in previous generations. So I think we have to focus on that and make sure that this yeah, a little bit this mental health crisis I think we're seeing, especially in younger people, that we want to deal with that in a better way.
Yeah, I think it makes sense to, when we implement any changes, looking at how it will influence the way people experience things, not just looking at the benefits, but also the potential consequences. Like, if everybody is perpetually online, what can the consequences be of that? Introducing like new systems and changes, what might be the unintended consequences? Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Gaetan Mertens. Thank you so much again for being a guest on the podcast. If people want to follow your work or connect with you, where can they go?
They can find me on Twitter, or you can, if you're more a researcher, you can follow me on ResearchGate. So those are some options if you want to connect, or LinkedIn is also an option. Yeah.
Okay, sweet. Thank you so much for being a guest. Anybody that wants to learn about anxiety or fear and actually see the research behind it, I would highly recommend go and check out Gaetan's papers. They are actually interesting. He has quite a few looking at COVID, and there was even one where they looked at conditioning with dogs and cats. And yeah, it's an interesting, paper to look at the approach. And yeah, thank you so much again for everything. Keep well, Gaetan. Cheers.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been fun and been a nice conversation, a lot of ideas. So it was really nice. Yeah, thanks.